Today's story is about four teenage friends who decide to go camping, but at night it turned into an absolute nightmare because someone or something paid those teens an unwanted visit. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1960, a 15-year-old girl named MB Yorkland climbed off the back of her boyfriend's motorcycle. Her boyfriend, 18-year-old Niels Gustafsson, had driven her 18 miles from their home in southern Finland to a beautiful forest and lake. They had come to camp with another couple who were a few minutes behind them. This second couple consisted of Niels' best friend Seppo and Seppo's girlfriend Anya. As Niels parked his motorcycle, MB looked out over the lake. The forest wrapped around the water, and people were out boating and swimming, enjoying themselves. Despite the activity, MB felt the place was peaceful and serene. For someone who loved nature as much as MB did, this felt like the perfect spot to celebrate her upcoming 16th birthday in a few days. Just then, MB heard another motorcycle approaching. She turned to see Seppo and Anya arriving. Seppo looked at MB, grinned, and dramatically swung the back wheel of his motorcycle as if he were in an action movie. MB thought it was hilarious and burst into laughter. Niels turned to see his girlfriend laughing heartily at Seppo. A moment later, all four friends were hugging and greeting each other excitedly. After catching up, the group walked toward a small shack by the water, a snack kiosk, to grab supplies before heading into the forest to set up camp. On their way, Seppo made a joke about how his motorcycle was far superior to Niels'. MB, walking beside Niels, laughed at the comment, but as she glanced at Niels, she noticed he looked upset, scowling at both her and Seppo. Feeling guilty, MB wondered if Niels thought she was flirting with Seppo by laughing at his jokes. Not wanting Niels to get the wrong idea, she glanced at him again, only to see him smiling and cheerful. Convinced she had imagined his earlier expression, MB squeezed his hand, and the two couples continued their walk to the kiosk. The snack kiosk was a small shack near the beach, with a house behind it where the owners lived. When they arrived, MB noticed that the woman working at the kiosk had her back to them and didn't seem interested in helping. MB called out politely, "Excuse me, we'd like to buy something." The woman spun around abruptly, glaring at MB. "What do you want?" she snapped. Startled by the hostility, MB mumbled an apology, unsure if she had done something wrong. She then asked politely if they could get a couple of beers and sodas before heading on their way. As this interaction unfolded, Seppo and Anya, who were standing behind MB, couldn't help but giggle. The woman's bizarre and unexpected behavior was simply too absurd. Meanwhile, the kiosk lady angrily bent down to grab the sodas and beer, huffing loudly as if it were a huge inconvenience. She slammed the items onto the counter with visible frustration. While the woman rang up their total at the cash register, MB's attention wandered to the house behind the shack, where this woman presumably lived. She noticed the front railing was lined with empty beer bottles, and she thought this might explain the woman's hostility. Any household that generated so many empty bottles probably wasn't the happiest place to live. Finally, the woman announced the total. Niels stepped forward and paid for the drinks instead of MB. As they gathered their purchases and turned to leave, the kiosk lady suddenly cleared her throat and asked if they were camping by the lake. To MB, it seemed like the woman was trying to be nice, perhaps to make up for her earlier rudeness. Smiling, MB replied that they were indeed camping by the lake and were excited about it. However, the woman's reaction was far from pleasant. She scowled and told them they should pitch their tent as far away as possible. The teenagers stood in awkward silence, unsure of how to respond. The kiosk lady then began shooing them away, gesturing for them to leave. As the group walked away, they heard the woman shout one final comment. She yelled that her family had dealt with plenty of trouble from wild teenagers camping around the lake, and that she and her husband were sick of it. At this point, Seppo, Niels, and Anya couldn't help but laugh. The woman's over-the-top hostility was so absurd it had become comical, but MB didn't find it funny. She found the woman's anger and demeanor unsettling, and it left her feeling uneasy. A few minutes later, the teens reached their motorcycles. Niels and MB hopped onto one, while Seppo and Anya got on the other. Together, they started down the wooded path leading to their campsite. The ride to their campsite was short, bringing them to a piece of land that jutted out into the lake. It was heavily forested, offering a stunning view of the water while remaining secluded among the trees. Upon arrival, Niels and Seppo parked their motorcycles against the trees and worked together to set up a simple canvas tent between two birch trees. With their campsite ready, the friends grabbed some beers and began to relax. It didn't take long for MB to completely forget about the unpleasant kiosk woman. She had been eagerly anticipating this trip, and now that she was here, surrounded by her friends, she felt at ease. MB was particularly excited about her relationship with Niels. It was still new, but it was clear that for once, her boyfriend liked her as much as she liked him. Niels was handsome, with dark brown hair he styled upward, and he always wore a leather jacket that added to his cool and confident demeanor. MB adored being around him. He made her feel mature and special. After about 30 minutes to an hour of drinking, swapping stories, and settling into the evening, the friends headed down to the water. They spent time swimming and continued to drink while lounging by the dock. As they tired of swimming, they lay on the dock gazing at the sky. Although it wasn't a true sunset, as the sun doesn't fully set in Finland during this time of year, they were treated to the beauty of a white night. The sky had a hazy glow, creating a serene and picturesque atmosphere. For MB, it felt like the perfect birthday celebration. She would later write in her diary that night about how amazing the day had been and how much fun she was having with Niels and her friends. When they were done at the dock, the teens gathered their belongings and returned to the campsite. They dried off, changed clothes, and all four piled into their small tent to sleep. One by one, they drifted off into a peaceful slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, MB woke up to the sound of rustling outside the tent. Curious, she wondered if one of her friends had gotten up. She sat up and peered out of the tent, but all she could see was the hazy glow of the white night. She couldn't tell if everyone was still inside the tent. Suddenly, a dark, shadowy figure moved in front of the tent's open flap, blocking the light entirely. The figure seemed to peer into the tent, and MB was horrified to see glowing red eyes staring back at her. Before she or anyone else could react, there was a snapping sound, and the tent collapsed on top of them. At 6 a.m. the following morning, two boys who had no connection to the four teenagers were fishing at the lake. They were positioned off to the side, gazing generally in the direction of the teens' campsite from the previous night. Unlike the day before, the lake was eerily quiet and deserted, almost like a ghost town. Suddenly, the boys noticed a young man with blonde hair emerge from the forest near the campsite. He was running away from that area. The boys watched him for a moment, puzzled, but soon lost interest and returned to their fishing. As the morning progressed, more people began to arrive at the lake. However, no one ventured near the campsite where the teenagers had been. That changed when a father and his two sons decided to explore the area and go swimming off the dock nearby. They followed the same wooded trail that Niels and Seppo had used the day before to reach the campsite. Upon reaching the clearing in the forest, the father immediately noticed a crumpled heap of canvas between two trees. At first, he couldn't make out what it was. Curious, he walked closer to investigate. As he got nearer, he realized the horrifying truth and quickly raised a hand to stop his sons from approaching. Turning to them, he said, "We have to leave right now." The father and his sons ran back up the trail, found a phone, and called the police. When the police arrived at the scene just before noon, they walked down to the campsite. There they saw the crumpled canvas tent. Scattered in and around it were the bodies of the four teenagers who had camped there the night before. Anya and Seppo hadn't even made it out of the tent. They had been brutally beaten and stabbed to death through the fabric of the collapsed tent. MB had managed to get out of the tent, but she didn't survive. Her body was found on top of the tent. She had multiple broken bones and had been stabbed a total of 15 times. Some of the stab wounds were inflicted while she was still alive, and others after her death. Beside her lay the body of her boyfriend, Niels. He was almost unrecognizable, his head having been savagely beaten. As officers examined the scene and searched through the teenagers' belongings, one officer knelt near the victims to inspect their injuries more closely. Suddenly, he heard a faint gasping sound. To everyone's shock, Niels, who they had presumed was dead, opened his eyes and looked up at the officer. Startled and unsure of what to do at first, the officer quickly stood and began shouting for a medic. Niels was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, but the scene left investigators baffled. The crime scene didn't make sense. Some items, like wallets and watches, were missing, suggesting a possible robbery. However, other things didn't align with that theory. The motorcycles the boys had driven to the campsite were still there, parked against the trees, but their keys were gone. Why take the keys but leave the motorcycles? Adding to the mystery, Niels's leather jacket and shoes were also missing. These items held personal value to Niels, but weren't valuable enough to motivate such a horrific crime. The investigators couldn't make sense of the evidence, and the case grew even more puzzling as they delved deeper into the details. Faced with the complexity of the crime scene, the police eventually called in the military to assist with the search. The military combed through the vast forest surrounding the campsite, and during their search, they made a significant discovery. Niels's shoes were found about 500 meters from the campsite, hidden under a pile of leaves. The shoes were speckled with blood, and nearby bloody tracks suggested that the killer had worn the shoes while leaving the campsite before discarding them. In the days following the murders, the police pursued dozens of leads across Finland, but none led to any breakthroughs. Niels, the sole survivor, eventually began to recover from his injuries, which included severe facial trauma and multiple broken bones. It took a long time before he was well enough to speak. When he finally could, he revealed that he had very little memory of the attack or the events of that day. However, he did recall one haunting detail. Amidst the chaos, he saw a dark, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Although chilling, this vague description was not actionable for the investigation. The only solid lead came from the two boys fishing at the lake the morning after the murders. They reported seeing a blonde-haired man running from the direction of the campsite. After the murders were reported, the boys realized the significance of what they had witnessed and shared this information with the police. Using their description, a composite sketch of the man was created and distributed across Finland. The sketch generated significant attention, with many people claiming they had seen the man. However, the resemblance of the sketch to many Finnish men led to numerous false reports. Just as the police were losing hope with this lead, they received a tip that stood out. The day after the murders, a man named Hans Osman checked into a hospital about 13 miles from the lake. He complained of severe stomach pains, but doctors suspected he was simply drunk and aggressive. Hans's appearance closely matched the composite sketch of the blonde-haired man. He was filthy, with dirt and mud covering his clothes and embedded under his fingernails, as though he had been digging with his hands. Red stains, which he refused to explain, were smeared on his clothes. Suspicious, one of the doctors contacted the police. During their interview with Hans, investigators discovered his erratic and unstable personality. He claimed to have a history of violence, membership in the Nazi Party, and ties to the Russian secret police, though these claims seemed dubious. Despite these alarming factors, Hans had an airtight alibi. On the night of the murders, he was 15 miles away in a different city, staying at his girlfriend's house along with her sister and brother-in-law. Frustrated but thorough, the police ruled Hans out as a suspect. Unfortunately, this pattern repeated throughout the investigation. Over time, the police interviewed more than 4,000 people, but none of the leads resulted in a clear suspect. Despite their extensive efforts, the case remained unsolved and gradually went cold. For 44 years, the murders at Lake Bodom remained unsolved. Numerous theories circulated, but no suspect was ever identified. However, in 2004, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They claimed that Niels Gustafsson, the 18-year-old boyfriend of Mia and the only surviving victim, was the killer. The prosecutors pointed to two key pieces of evidence to support this theory. The first was a woman who had been staying at the lake on the night of the murders. She recalled overhearing a violent argument between two men before the murders occurred. Prosecutors speculated that this altercation was between Niels and Seppo, possibly due to Niels's jealousy over Mia, who seemed to be flirting with Seppo. They suggested that Niels, feeling betrayed, may have been so enraged that he took out his anger on Mia, stabbing her repeatedly. The second piece of evidence was Niels' shoes, which had been found under a pile of leaves 500 meters from the campsite. The shoes contained bloodstains, but none of the blood belonged to Niels. Prosecutors theorized that Niels had murdered his friends while wearing the shoes, then ran away from the scene, discarding the shoes to hide evidence. He later returned to the campsite, inflicted self-inflicted injuries to make it seem like he had been attacked too, and tried to make the crime look like an outsider's work. In the end, Niels was arrested for the murders at the age of 62, working as a bus driver and married with children. At his trial, he maintained his innocence and stuck to his story. Though he had little memory of the attack itself, he clearly remembered seeing a dark figure with glowing red eyes during the chaos. The jury believed him, and he was acquitted. Finland also awarded him a large monetary settlement for his mental suffering due to the trauma of the attack. Lake Bodom has since become famous because of these murders. People visit the lake to be near the site of the killings, and various stories have circulated over the years. Many are outlandish, such as claims that the campsite is cursed and haunted by the ghosts of the murdered teens. These theories have little credibility. Other stories, such as a photograph circulating on the internet, showing a man in the crowd at one of the teens' funerals, closely resembling the composite sketch of the blonde man seen fleeing the scene, have generated interest. Some have even speculated this man could be Hans Ostman, who had been a suspect earlier in the case. However, the identity of the person in the photo has never been confirmed, and this lead has gone nowhere. A more credible theory involves a man named Carl Voldemar Gillstrom, a 55-year-old local who lived near Lake Bodom. Carl was known for his violent outbursts, often attacking campers in the area. He would get drunk and cause trouble, even cutting down tents, throwing rocks, and once even firing a gun at a camper. After the murders, locals who were familiar with Carl suggested to the police that he was the likely killer. However, Carl's wife, who worked at a kiosk near the lake, provided him with an alibi, and the police dismissed him as a serious suspect. 9 years later, the case had gone cold. Carl was having a drink with his neighbor near the lake when he shockingly admitted to being the Lake Bodom murderer. His neighbor, horrified, suggested Carl should drown himself, and the next day Carl was found dead in the lake, near where the teens had been attacked. The police were unable to determine whether his death was accidental, a suicide, or if someone else was involved. Still, many believe Carl's guilt led to his tragic end, fulfilling the grim suggestion made by his neighbor. If you enjoy our stories, which are sometimes inspired by real events, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting content we'll be sharing in the future. There's plenty of great stories coming your way, so stay tuned.